Hi, today I want to talk about Vladimir Jankélévitch and his book, Music and the Ineffable. Jankélévitch was born in 1903 and lived until 1985. He was a French philosopher and musicologist, son of Ukrainian Jewish parents who immigrated to France. In 1922, he started studying at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and worked under Professor Bergson, the then world-famous philosopher, and Jankélévitch would remain faithful to Bergson's philosophy throughout his entire life. In 1931, he published the book titled Henri Bergson, which was the first complete volume to deal with Bergson's thought on a whole, sort of his entire life trajectory. But at the time, Bergson had still not yet written his final book. Bergson gave high praises for the book and even said that it was an original work in and of itself that went beyond anything Bergson himself had achieved. Now, Jankélévitch is pretty squarely within the French spiritualist tradition. He wrote his doctorate thesis on Schelling, and Félix Ravaisson, who's one of the major figures in this French spiritualist tradition, actually studied with Schelling, so Schelling's relation to French spiritualism has been there for a long time. And the originality of Jankélévitch's thinking can really be seen in moral philosophy, as well as in musicology and the philosophy of music. From 1941 to 51, Jankélévitch spent the decade fighting the resistance. World War II and the Holocaust had a large impact on Jankélévitch's thinking and philosophy. Similarly to Emmanuel Levinas, who was his lifelong friend. And while Jankélévitch is not considered to be part of the phenomenological tradition himself, he's much more on this Bergsonian and French spiritualist side, there was a rich friendship and dialogue between Levinas and Jankélévitch, and both saw Bergson as a major influence on their ethical thinking. Jankélévitch wrote a number of books on musicology, music criticism, and philosophy of music. He had a book in 1938 on Gabriel Fauré, one on Ravel in 1939, one on Debussy in 1950, and Music and the Ineffable in 1961. Jankélévitch was the chair of moral philosophy at the Sorbonne from 1951 until 1978. The majority of his numerous works have not yet been translated into English. Now let's zoom in on Music and the Ineffable. Jankélévitch pushes us to look at the most difficult to understand aspects of music, the aspects that we really fail to give voice to, the ineffable aspects of music. And this includes sort of unconscious aspects, things that we don't notice while we're listening to music. So music has this enchanting power. It kind of pulls us in. It captivates our attention. And we don't pay attention to the fact that that's happening when we listen to music. We listen and we are captivated by the listening experience and don't pay attention to that fact happening to our consciousness. Jankélévitch refers to this as the charm of music. And music is this multifaceted thing. Obviously, Jankélévitch is a lover of music. He was himself a pianist and was listening to music all the time and writing books on it. But he wants to say that music is a profoundly multivalent potentiality. It can go in 100 directions. There are multiple tendencies within it. And this goes back to Bergson's idea of qualitative multiplicity, a heterogeneous set of possibilities which tend in different directions, are all contained within what we might call the essence of music. And therefore, music is a blessing and a curse. It is kind of like habit. It can push against our will, or it can help in the movements that are conducive to our will. It is both a medicine and a poison. Now, in the first chapter of Music and the Ineffable, Jankélévitch is really doing a historical overview of the relation that music has had to philosophy and the way that it has typically been understood as either a threat to rationality or is exalted as a principle of rationality within the cosmos. So he looks at its moral and its metaphysical implications, and In order to do so, he turns mostly to Plato and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But his own position is far more Bergsonian, and Bergson only comes up tangentially within the first chapter, and in the later chapters, he develops much more in depth his Bergsonian interpretation of music and the ineffable through Bergsonian philosophy and the Bergsonian metaphysics of duration and intuition. So before I go on to unpack what Jankélévitch has to say in chapter 1, let me just say a bit about Bergson's idea of the ineffable, which Jankélévitch is building on. For Bergson, our experience within consciousness is highly complex. It is very intricately detailed and endlessly nuanced, so that no two moments of our psychological life are the same. Bergson, even early in his philosophy, comes to define psychological facts as perpetual flux, a continuous becoming, right, that we experience immediately, in which every moment is singular, unique within time, unique within what's happening in the universe, and unique within the history of, we could even say, thermodynamics. No two moments within the universe through the second law of thermodynamics are exactly the same because of the arrow of time. Each moment is unique and cannot be interchanged with any other moment. It can only be placed in the exact position in which it occurs within time. So all of our psychological facts are unique instances of existence. And all of our psychological facts, according to Bergson, can be connected to the whole of our past. All of our memories, all of our habits, all of our present perceptions. So every psychological fact, in fact, is linked to the whole of our psychological life, the whole of our duration. Psychological facts are repugnant to being translated into language. Language is necessarily general, is necessarily static, and it is necessarily disconnected. I'll go through each of those now. It is general because when we talk about some thing, whether it's a tree or a cat or what have you, this can apply to multiple instances. If a word can only apply to one instance, if a word were truly singular, it would refer to one event and never any other event than that one. And so language would be incapable of actually speaking of different things with the same word at different times. And the words must be static as well. So if the word tree later refers to things that aren't plants, then language has failed and we have not actually designated things. And while our psychological facts are not general, they are singular. And while they are not static, they are dynamic, they're fluxing, and they are each unique and different within time. And lastly, they are language and words are disconnected. They are what they are by being negations of what they are not. So if this is a tree, it's not a car, right? And it's not anything else but a tree. So when language expresses something, it conveys it as disconnected, as static, and as general. And therefore, it goes in a direction that is utterly repugnant to psychological facts and to expressing them in their reality. Bergson also liked the analogy drawn from calculus between the integral, which relates directly to a differential, and the integral and the differential are distinct from the derivative. Okay? So think about a curve. A curve can be broken up into an infinite number of small curves, and you can take the whole curve at once. The whole curve taken at once is described by an integral, which is the function that describes the continuous shifting of direction that traces the curving. The differential, of which there are an infinite number of them, are these kind of potential parts within the whole that we could divide up. Now, when we take a differential and zoom in as small as we can, an infinitely small amount of change, we can transcribe, we can transpose that differential into a tangent, which is a straight line. So you can draw an infinite number of straight lines which touch the curve at a point, and at that point, we can imagine an infinitely small differential of curving movement. Now, language is to our psychological facts, our inner duration, what the derivative is to the integral and its differentials. There is a continuity of our duration, and the intellect, all it can do is describe it tangentially. It can translate it into something that it's not, and something that could never generate the reality itself. So you would never be able to go from the intellectual derivative taken from our immediate experience and put into language, and then reconstruct the duration itself. And Bergson extends this metaphor by looking at aesthetic experience in his first major work, Time and Free Will. And in that, he sees graceful movement as akin to the inner curving movement that our analysis can find only tangential linear movements. And he wants to say that the graceful movement is not made up of a series of linear movements that are interrupted in their trajectory to bend at a angle, but rather changes direction at every moment, and can only be understood internally by ourselves initiating a curvature movement, and at which point we gain an intuitive sense of this movement as it's being created from within. And therefore, the aesthetic feeling behind grace involves something like an auto-affection. It is known from having been lived. We see someone move gracefully, and we feel sympathetically what it would be like for ourselves to move gracefully. It probably excites within us a sensory motor feeling, a nascent movement, a possibility to move. And this is pleasurable, and it excites within us, it evokes within us the feeling of moving gracefully, the feeling of moving within a curve, of having intentionality to movement. And we can also think of the idea of style. Style takes gestural expression, and it does it in a singular way, right? A certain writer has a style, and you cannot turn this into a law or a certain set of rules to follow. But there are certain idiosyncratic elements to it, and when we read a number of books by an author, or we hear a number of songs by a musician, we pick up on their style, and there's this singular quality that is really difficult to explain, but we can feel it when we live it, right? And it excites within us a certain feeling of potential and of intentionality and attitude. And it is by assuming these attitudes and sympathizing with them that the meaning behind the gracefulness, the style, and behind music more generally, we appreciate it, but we cannot put it into a formula. We cannot explain it even. We cannot give voice to it in language that is adequate. And if we do give descriptions of it, those descriptions end up only being relevant for someone who has already experienced that person's style, that composer's style. So this is the general category, we might say, of ineffable things, going back to Bergson. Our lived duration is infinitely rich. It's our entire past, all of our experiences, all the nuances felt in our body and our emotions, every infinitely complex and nuance, shading, detail. And now it's important to point out that Bergson and Jankélévitch, when they say that music is ineffable, they are not saying that we should stop analyzing it or that we shouldn't talk about it. They're saying that no matter how much we analyze it and how deep we get in our phenomenological descriptions of musical experience, we will never exhaust or replace the immediate duration of musical experience. Now, the next major idea in the book is that of charm, and this goes back to Plotinus. A charm is something hypnotizing, it's captivating, it attracts us. We are under its spell, right? It pulls us in. But charm is not a palpable, visible entity. It's not a something. It's an almost nothing, as he says, presque rien. Almost nothing, a vaporous, shadowy kind of thing. The charm is nowhere, right? And yet it's everywhere. Obviously, there can be hooks, something we can point to and say, that is hooking me, it is charming me. The catchiness, right? But even that can be pretty hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that is doing that. And furthermore, we can be charmed by music that isn't catchy. The charm is within the entire duration of it, in the same way that grace is not in any instantaneous moment of the movement, but is in the continuity of movement over time. And this idea goes back to Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, who talked about the inner intensive form of movement, which is gesture and which they call a serpentine or undulating, a snaking movement. And within that is a kind of rhythmic notion, because snaking movement is a kind of periodic rhythm, and a wave is a snaking movement. A rhythm can't be heard in any single beat. It's only felt over time as a pattern within time. So this almost nothing, which exists only within time, is also je ne sais quoi. It is an unnameable quality. It's a I know not what. It is a thing that we cannot exactly put our finger on, but which we feel, right? It has this singular quality to it, something unique, but is almost uncomparable to anything else. This implies that the charm of any song is unique to its own pattern. And while genres might in some way have the same intention, the same feel, charming us in the same way, perhaps, they would still be unique to the particular patterning of the sounds in the song, in each unique song. So Jankélévitch approaches musical experience as something ineffable because of the psychological facts of our duration are flux, singular, and holistic. So music is a charm that is almost nothing and yet has a particular quality which we can only experience. And which we can only experience over time and by modulating our consciousness to the experience, and we will never experience the same piece of music twice. So basically, Jankélévitch is looking at the question, what is the power of music over consciousness, over self, over body? And he's trying to bring together the history of philosophy on this question into a Bergsonian perspective, which he also mixes with the ideas of the Dionysian and the Apollonian from Nietzsche. And as we will see, he favors the nocturnal, dark, mysterious, dreamlike Dionysian side of music, saying something like, there's always a nocturnal twilight, even in the most sunny music. And likewise, even the most cerebral, logical, or rational music would also entail a Dionysian revelry, enchantment, madness, as well as transformation and novelty. So Jankélévitch wants to reopen the question of the metaphysical significance of music, and he does this by going, in a way, through the history from Plato to Schopenhauer. For Socrates, music is metaphysical because it relates to the soul as a whole. Music affects the innermost part of the soul, and it determines the shape of its whole and the whole of society in the Republic. Now, metaphysics is generally speaking about the whole, whether that is God or the whole cosmos, as opposed to science, which deals with parts of the cosmos. And it deals with the whole of the soul, while psychology deals with the parts of the soul. Of course, before Plato, the Pythagoreans thought that the cosmos needed to be understood through analogy with musical harmony, or not even analogy, but that these were, you might think, like fractal repetitions of the same structure within the sonic world and within the cosmos as a whole. Everything that we see in nature, everything in the phenomenal world as humans, is varying degrees of tension, tuning the physical contraries like hot and cold, moist and dry, the elements, into organized entities. And this organization is the harmony of these forces. And so intelligence permeates the universe, and this is audible to us in musical harmony, but it is visible to us in biology and in society. Now, this lends itself to a more static view of cosmology, where there is a transcendent harmony that is eternal and changeless, and we merely imitate it within the world. Now, this isn't clear to be the Pythagorean view. It's not clear within the work, for example, of Philolaus, that he thinks that there's a static tuning for the universe and that doesn't adjust over time. And we see this again in the Timaeus of Plato. In the Timaeus, the demiurge is readjusting the tuning of the universe as it begins to play out and evolve. The inability of changeless rational order dictating before time what happens in the evolution thereof. But regardless of how Plato questions the significance of the eternal and changeless harmony, it's clear that his philosophy leads to a view called Platonism, which takes eternal, changeless ideas to be the archetypes of all reality, such that nothing novel can possibly happen, but everything is an imperfect way of imitating something eternal. And the musicological equivalent of this theory is basically that there are a set of pure eternal songs, divine songs, and we create imitations of these that maybe use aspects of different ones, but they're imperfect and they, mix elements that shouldn't be put together and are impure. And there is, of course, the rejection of this theory, which is often called nominalism. And nominalism says that basically forms don't really exist. They're just the names that we give to things, the generalities that we use to understand flux. And the view that sits halfway between this idealistic view of Platonic form and the nominalist view, which basically reduces form to underlying movement, there's a view of dynamic form, such as what we find in living things, where form is inseparable from matter, where intention is inseparable from embodiment and movement. And here we find a sort of Aristotelian view of the activity of life and the activity of musical perception. Each activity, according to Aristotle, has a unique integral joy or pleasure that accompanies it and enriches that activity. So when we listen to music, there can be the pleasure that arises from sensing the sounds. The sounds themselves are pleasant. But there's this secondary and more profound joy that comes from our engagement with the music, our activity listening and creating music, or dancing along. Schopenhauer comes out of this idea of psychical activity as passed down also by Leibniz and by Spinoza. Spinoza's view of conatus, which means striving, seems to be central to Schopenhauer's whole view of the will. Now, Schopenhauer's view differs from Bergson's in very important ways. And at certain points, the difference seems only very slight. So this view taking conatus, or this kind of psychical energy, as Bergson would say, that is the will, there seems to be a huge alignment between Bergson and Schopenhauer. Both want to say that the immediate experience of music is beyond representation, beyond concept, that it is ineffable. But the way that they want to do this ends up being very different, and the metaphysical implications of it end up being very different. Schopenhauer sees it as a kind of dialectical progression of the will, and that the will as rational is at the top of a hierarchy within the cosmos, and that this cosmic hierarchy is a static, rational structure. It's the four-voice harmony, which spreads across multiple octave and represents the very ontological structure of the universe, from matter to plant life to animal life, and ultimately to rationality, which tops it off and makes it complete. And while the realm of the will is this pulsing dynamism of ever-changing desires, Schopenhauer is also a Platonist and believes that the forms exist and that there is this intelligible realm existing independently somewhat of the will. Music allows us to experience the will because it cuts us off from the rat race of samsara, the attachment and addiction to interacting with the world and extracting advantage from it. Music is supremely disinterested. It cuts us off from our immediate needs and allows us to abide in an imaginary world outside of history and out of our visible world. Bergson says something really similar in his book Laughter from 1900. I'll read the long passage here. What is the object of art? Could reality come into direct contact with sense and consciousness? Could we enter into immediate communication with things and with ourselves? Probably art would be useless, or rather, we should all be artists. For then our soul would continually vibrate in perfect accord with nature. Our eyes, aided by memory, would carve out in space and fix in time the most inimitable pictures, hewn in the living marble of the human form, fragments of statues, beautiful as the relics of ancient statuary, would strike by passing glance. Deep in our souls, we should hear the strains of an inner life's unbroken melody, a music that is oftentimes gay, but more frequently plaintive and always original. All this is around and within us, and yet no whit of it do we distinctly perceive. Between nature and ourselves, nay, between ourselves and our own consciousness, a veil is interposed, a veil that is dense and opaque for the common herd, thin, almost transparent for the artist and poet. What fairy wove that veil? Was it done in malice or friendliness? We had to live, and life demands that we grasp things in their relation to our needs. Life is action. Life implies that the acceptance of a utilitarian side of things so that we respond to them in appropriate reactions. All other impressions must be dimmed or else reach us vague and blurred. I look and I think I see. I listen and I think I hear. I examine myself and I think I am reading the very depths of my heart. But what I see and what I hear of the outer world is purely and simply a selection made by my senses to serve as a light to my conduct. What I know of myself is what comes to the surface, what participates in my action. My senses and my consciousness, therefore, give me no more than the practical simplification of reality. In the vision they furnish me of myself, of things, the differences that are useless to man are obliterated. The resemblances that are useful are emphasized, always are traced out for me in advance, along which my activity is to travel. These ways are the ways all mankind has trod before me. Things have been classified with a view to the use I can derive from them. And it is this classification I perceive far more clearly than the colors and the shapes of things. Doubtless, man is vastly superior to lower animals in this respect. It is not very likely that the eye of the wolf makes any distinction between a kid and a lamb. Both appear to the wolf as the same identical quarry, alike easy to pounce upon, alike good to devour. We, for our part, make a distinction between the goat and a sheep, and we can tell one goat from another, one sheep from another. The individuality of things or of beings escapes us unless it is materially to our advantage to perceive it. Even when we do take note of it, as we distinguish one man from another, it is not the individuality itself of the eye that the eye grasps, i.e., the entirely original harmony of forms and colors, but only one or two features that will make practical recognition easier. In short, we do not see the actual things themselves. In most cases, we confine ourselves to reading the labels affixed to them. This tendency, the result of need, has become an even more pronounced under the influence of speech. For words, with the exception of proper nouns, all denote genera. The word, which only takes note of the most ordinary function and commonplace aspect of things, intervenes between it and ourselves and would conceal its form from our eyes were that form not already masked beneath the necessities that brought the word into existence. Not only external objects, but even our own mental states are screened from us in their innermost, their personal aspect, in their original life they possess. When we feel love or hatred, when we are gay or sad, it is really the feeling itself that reaches our consciousness with those innumerable fleeting shades of meaning and deep resounding echoes that makes something altogether our own. We should all, were it so, be novelists, poets, or musicians. Mostly, however, we perceive nothing but the outward display of our mental states. We catch only the impersonal aspect of our feeling, that aspect which speech has set down once for all because it is almost the same in the same condition for all men. Thus, even in our individuality escapes our ken. We move amidst generalities and symbols, as within a tilled yard in which the force is effectively pitted against other forces, and fascinated by action, tempted by it for our own good, on to the field it has selected. We live in a zone midway between things and ourselves, external to things, external to ourselves. From time to time, however, in a fit of absent-mindedness, nature raises up souls that are more detached from life, not with that intentional, logical, systematic detachment, the result of reflection and philosophy, but rather with a natural detachment, one intimate in the structure of sense or consciousness, which at once reveals itself in a virginal manner, so to speak, of seeing, hearing, and thinking. Were this detachment complete, did the soul no longer cleave to action by any of its perceptions, it would be the soul of an artist such as the world has never seen. It would excel alike in every art at the same time, or rather, it would fuse them all into one. It would perceive all things in their native purity, the forms, colors, sounds of the physical world, all as well as the subtlest movements in our inner life. But this is asking too much of nature. Even for such as us, she has made artists. It is by accident, and on one side, that she has lifted the veil. In one direction, only has she forgotten to rivet the perception to the need. And since each direction corresponds to what we call a sense, although one of its senses, through that sense alone, the artist usually is wedded to art. Hence, originally the diversity of arts. Hence, also the speciality of predispositions. This one applies himself to colors and forms, since he loves colors and form for form, since he perceives them for their sake and not for his own sake. It is the inner life of things that he sees appearing through their forms and colors. Little by little, he insinuates into them our own perceptions, baffled though we may be at the outset. For a few moments at least, he diverts us from the prejudices of form and colors that has come between us and reality. And thus he realizes the loftiest ambition of art, which here consists in revealing to us nature. Others, again, retire within themselves, beneath the thousand rudimentary actions which are outward and visible signs of the emotion, behind the commonplace, conventional expression that both reveals and conceals the individual mental state. It is the emotion, the original mood to which they attain in its undefiled essence, and then, to induce us to make the same effort ourselves, they contrive to us to see something of what they have seen, by rhythmical arrangements of words which thus become organized and animated with a life of their own. They tell us, or rather they suggest, the things that speech was not calculated to express. Others delve even deeper still, beneath these joys and sorrows, which can at a pitch be translated into language. They grasp something that has nothing in common with language, certain rhythms of life, and beneath that are closer to man than his innermost feelings, being the living law, varying with each individual of his enthusiasm and despair, hope and regret. By setting free and emphasizing this music, they force it upon our attention. They compel us willy-nilly to fall with it. And passers-by will all join in the dance. And thus they impel us to set in motion, in the depths of our being, some secret chord which was waiting to thrill. So art, whether it be painting or sculpture, poetry or music, has no other object than to brush aside the utilitarian symbols, the conventional and socially accepted generalities, in short, everything that veils reality from us, in order to bring us face to face with reality itself. It is from a misunderstanding on this point that the disputes between realism and idealism in art has arisen. Art is certainly only a more direct vision of reality, but this purity of perception implies a break with utilitarian convention, an innate and specially localized disinterestedness of sense or consciousness, in short, a certain immateriality of life, which is what has always been called idealism, so that we might say, without in any way playing upon the meaning of the words, that realism is in the work when idealism is in the soul, and that it is only through ideality that we can resume contact with reality. Okay, so I'll stop reading there. That was obviously a long quotation, and it keeps going on, and it's extremely interesting. It's the longest and most sustained dealing with the question of art within Bergson's work. The theme also comes up again in every one of his books and within his lecture notes as well. The basic idea is that in order to understand aesthetic experience, we have to understand it as a change to our consciousness, the way that we attune our consciousness to experience. So typically, we relate to things through our needs and through our habits and through social communication. Language has made us automatically accept stereotype and generality. Something that is charming steps out of our generality and our routine. And here it would be helpful to bring in the laws of habit, which this idea goes back to Pierre Mandelbrot and through Félix Ravaisson and into Bergson, and actually was originally stated by Thomas Reid. It says, all activities, if they are continued or repeated, gain in regularity, strength, precision, or richness. That is, to continue or repeat any activity, like practicing the piano, makes it easier to do, more regular. You hit the keys in the same way, you have better control. and it enriches the experience overall for the person as well. In terms of entropy, this can be understood as an increase in order that is offset by the need for flow of energy through the system. There is also a continuous decrease in conscious awareness that accompanies habituation. Habits and skills tend to become automatisms, things that happen automatically without our will stepping in or without them having to be initiated voluntarily by effort. And we can do them without paying attention, right? Like we can talk while riding a bicycle or have thoughts and while walking. Okay, so the second law of habit is that the continuity or repetition, again, but this time of passivity, sensation, over time, sensitivity gradually diminishes. So repetition and continuity leads to insensitive sensation. Think if you have to get a shot every day, at first it hurts a lot, but gradually we become calloused. We no longer feel it. And background noise tends to become inaudible. If you play a low frequency in the background, or if there's a air conditioner humming, we tend to tune this out. And so the second law describes a kind of tendency towards homeostasis. And I think we can describe here from our own personal experience a sort of pleasure at the reconstitution of our body and our mind to its balance and homeostasis. And these laws of habit actually have certain resonances with the second law of thermodynamics, especially the idea of irreversibility and the notion that there can be an emergence of order which involves disorder, but also increases order in proportion to the disorder that it creates. But of course, that it compartmentalizes order and ejects disorder. And this requires that its system have a steady flow of energy through it. This is essential to Ilya Prigoghine's view of dissipative structures and self-organization. Habit is a kind of self-organization and emergent unity of movements within the body. And according to the French spiritualist tradition, going back to Mandabaran and Ravaisson, habit requires a material alteration in the cerebral tissues, in our sense organs themselves, and in our muscular tissues. But habit is not reducible to that material alteration within the body. Habits have a virtual existence in addition to their actual existence as contained in the body, as a trace within the body. A skill or one's character has a certain tendency to it to move and act in certain ways. The potential of a musician, their skill, is a virtuality that is, in some sense, all of the past musical expressions of that musician, their whole entire past, and all of their practicing and everything they've ever played before. But their potential as a musician goes beyond what they've done before. They have the possibility of playing new things and adapting and changing. And so too, habit is more than what it's done. It is this potentiality to adapt itself to new circumstances and evolve. And in addition to these laws of habit, we could add a couple corollaries that are observations that come from the study of habit. A habit will continue until it is replaced by another, or if we are removed from the relevant context in which that habit operates. There are also convergent and confluent habits, as well as divergent and dissonant habits. Certain habits will amplify each other and work together and are conducive to a lifestyle that promotes each of those habits. And of course, there can be habits which disrupt such synergy within our life. And habits are on a spectrum from voluntary expression to automatism, where we have absolutely no control. Now, from this rich discussion of habit coming from French spiritualism, Bergson adds two more stipulations to this in outlining exactly what he means by metaphysics. He says that, first, our thought patterns are shaped by the habits of our attention to life, or we could say our attachment to life. This nicely summarizes Mandelbrot's first book, The Influence of Habit on the Faculty of Thinking. Our thoughts are influenced by habit. They are entirely shaped by our habits. And from this, Bergson gives a second proposition, which says that the patterns of thought, which are derived from our daily life, from our attention to life, they can occasionally be useful in science, though they are not always. But they are unsuited, wholly unsuited to understanding the soul in psychology and doing metaphysics, which comes from a study of psychology. We could say that these are not laws of habit, but rather the laws of our duration and our apprehension of it. It is beyond a doubt that our understanding is shaped by our habits, and that in order to understand ourselves and reality, we need to alter these habits and make a change within the attunement of our consciousness. The unique way that our duration comes to shape and form itself in its ever-evolving progression.